Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I am a detransitioned male, and on this channel I talk about gender stuff. This video is going to be a continuation of my previous video where I talked about my own personal experiences with autogynephilia. And for those that don't know, autogynephilia is a theoretical construct used to explain why some trans women transition, and in general is meant to explain certain, phenomenon about, having what we might call cross-gender fantasy, and the relationship of cross-gender fantasy to trans women's, desires for transition, etc. And as I said in my previous video, where this theory is controversial is when it's used as a kind of universal theory to explain, why most trans women transition. It's like basically whenever it's used to generalize about, broad swaths of people, that's when you get into trouble. So I'm not going to do that. I'm only talking about my own personal life. I'm not, applying this theory to anyone else other than myself. But when I read this theory, it sort of rings true for me in my life and my experience and my gender history, my history of cross-gender fantasy and my history of transition, and like why I believe my cross-gender fantasy and the autogynephilic arousal patterns that came from cross-gender fantasy, those were like a direct causal factor in why I transitioned. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about a alternative theory to autogynephilia that was developed by Julia Serrano, a well-known trans academic, scholar, writer. In general, I've been a pretty big fan of Julia Serrano over the years. Her writings were very influential to me when I was, doing my own trans scholarship. For those that don't know, I actually have written a book on transgender feminism. It is under the name Rachel Ann Williams. The book's called Transgressive. It's a collection of 40 essays on trans feminism. My opinions and views have changed quite a lot since I wrote that book. That book came out of an early transition experience. So, obviously, as I got further into my transition, my views changed a lot. And now that I've detransitioned, my views have changed even more. But I still stand by the book. I think happy with the contributions I made to the discourse in that book. But yeah, so Julia Serrano, she has critiqued the theory of autogynephilia along various lines, challenging the empirical data, challenging the sort of ideological typology behind it, and more importantly, she's offered a sort of like alternative model that she calls the female embodiment fantasy model. And the key difference with this theory is that she basically proposes that a trans woman who, according to the autogynephilic model, is a non-classical trans woman. So, didn't know from a young age, attracted to women and femininity, transitioned, later in life, developed gender dysphoria later in life, so it wasn't evident from a very young age, not, super effeminate as a young child, etc. That's kind of like the non-classical story. That was certainly true in my case. I was not, overly feminine as a child. I had normal rough and tumble play. I never had, identity issues as a young child, but I was interested in women's clothing from a young age. And that kind of tied into, what eventually became a pattern of cross-dressing fetishism, essentially. And that cross-dressing fetishism, eventually evolved into, full-blown trans identity and gender dysphoria, and which led to transition, etc. So according to the Autogynephilia theory, the sort of cross-gender arousal fantasies, they sort of come first, because the theory basically says it is the sexual aspect of those fantasies, which is essentially a form of inverted heterosexuality. So with heterosexuality, you're attracted to femininity and women, and then you sort of turn that inside, and so you're attracted to that in yourself, and that causes arousal when you embody aspects of womanhood, either clothing or behavior, expression, or fantasies about the anatomy. And so according to the autogynephilic theory, all that sexual aspect is foundational. That comes first. And then gender dysphoria, which is the sort of identity stuff, comes later. So the sexual aspect is the causal origin of the trans identity. Now, according to Serrano's female embodiment fantasy model, it's kind of the other way around, where she posits that there's this subconscious sex, which is, so a trans woman would have a subconscious sex of being, a female subconscious sex, which is incongruous with, their physical body. And the subconscious sex causes these non-classical trans women to essentially go through a cross-dressing phase, and the cross-dressing phase arises out of sort of social factors, such as the taboo around males, natal males being feminine, the taboo of feminine men, essentially, and other social factors such as the fact that women's clothing is highly sexualized due to social factors in our society. So on her model, it is so the subconscious sex comes first. You're kind of born with that, essentially. But social factors prevent these non-classical trans women from coming to terms with that subconscious sex, and they sort of cope with their subconscious sex by going through a cross-dressing phase, and it's in that cross-dressing phase where you have the sort of classical autogynephilic arousal patterns from cross-gender fantasy. And so she sort of like inverts the theory where it is the subconscious sex identity which causes the autogynephilic cross-dressing arousal patterns, and then once you transition, you have a better coping model compared to the cross-dressing fantasy. And then once you transition, you go on hormones and you sort of normalize everything, that arousal pattern fades away and it just becomes normal. And and that's sort of what she offers as one of the big critiques of the autogynephilic model, is that it can't account for the fact that once these non-classical trans women transition, that arousal pattern goes away, and dressing in women's clothing and having secondary sex characteristics of females, it's no longer an arousing thing, and your fantasies just become sort of normal, I guess. Now, like I said, I'm only talking about my own personal experiences in regards to this theory. And I'm going to sort of argue that the causal story on the original autogynephilic model more closely approximates, how I interpret my own life going in terms of the sort of causal story of like what caused which in terms of the chicken and the egg. So for me, it was almost certainly the cross-dressing arousal that caused the gender dysphoria rather than the gender dysphoria causing the cross-dressing arousal. Because when I was a young kid, like the very first thing that I latched onto as far as like cross-dressing was hosiery, like, stockings and pantyhose and stuff like this. And I was very into this, and there was a sexual component to this from a very young age. And even prior to that, I had sort of always been kind of curious about women's clothing and stuff, but it was really this sexual interest in hosiery that was the foundational thing that kicked off the whole process. And then as I got older, as a teenager, watching trans porn was a big factor as well. And so and this cross-dressing paraphilia fetish, this particular fascination with this one type of clothing, that kind of snowballed essentially. And then it, got more and more involved and complicated. And, I started, not just being interested in hosiery, but, all elements of women's clothing, to the point where, it eventually became, full-blown cross-dressing, where I wasn't just, interested in the hosiery. I wanted to like fully dress and the whole, shebang. And so from there, like, I wanted to cross-dress full-time, essentially. And then I started learning about all this trans stuff. And, when I learned about the trans stuff, I sort of realized that like life with these desires would be easier if I identified as a trans woman, because being a trans woman is socially acceptable, but being a relatively socially acceptable, I should say, but being a cross-dresser is not. So which am I going to choose? I'm going to identify as trans, because there's like a social model for people to do that is like, socially acceptable. And once I decided to identify as trans and transition and start hormones and all this stuff, that is when the gender dysphoria and the subconscious sex, in terms of like having a feminine gender identity, that's when all that really started. So the dysphoria in terms of feeling discontent with my identity as a male, and sort of like feeling uncomfortable with identifying as a man, like sort of like when I started feeling like a repulsion from identifying as a male, that happened much later than the cross-dressing fantasy stuff. Because when I was like growing up as a teenager and all this stuff, and then like in my 20s, early 20s, like, doing the cross-dressing stuff, like I was a cross-dresser, but like identifying as a man never really bothered me. And I didn't have this incongruence in my identity with being a man until much later, when I was like 28 years old. And it wasn't until I started my transition and I started, developing this social persona of a trans feminine person, a trans woman, that, the sort of subconscious sex identity stuff really arose. So that's sort of my counter example to, Serrano's embodiment fantasy model, where for me, the cross-dressing came first, and then the identity stuff and dysphoria came later. And then I sort of, during that phase, I kind of retrojected my memory to be compatible with the embodiment fantasy model, where I sort of like convinced myself that the subconscious sex was there all along from very young age. But I think it was in a way a coping mechanism, because that's what Serrano says, and she says that the cross-dressing was a coping mechanism to deal with the subconscious sex. But for me, I think the self-identity of saying I have the subconscious sex, that became a coping mechanism to make it easier to have a socially acceptable narrative about being a trans woman. But I fully understand where Serrano's coming from in terms of like her dislike of autogynephilia as a theory, because when you read it, it sort of makes out people who have this AGP as being like sexual deviants and perverts and stuff. And so there's a lot of stigma that comes from sort of accepting that this theory is true of yourself. And again, I'm not talking about other people, I'm talking about my own life. And there's definitely a lot of shame and stigma about accepting that this is true of yourself, that like, hey, like I have a paraphilic interest in women's clothing, and that was a foundational element of why I decided to take hormones and socially transition and live full-time in this like feminine persona. Like it's really tough to accept that about yourself, because any time you're talking about arousal as like a foundational driver of like why you do the things you do, it's just stigmatizing, because it makes you seem like a sex crazed pervert or something. But the model though accounts for the fact that the sex stuff is not like a it doesn't explain like 100% of the phenomenon. Like I said in my previous video, like just because the sexuality component is at the foundational causal origins of like my life story in terms of my gender issues, that doesn't mean that every single expression of femininity is a sexual expression, because it sort of gets normalized after a time and it becomes sort of integrated into your self-concept. And that's why these sort of creators of the autogynephilic theory conceptualized it as a sexual orientation, because a sexual orientation encompasses far more than just a sexual act. It's it's about your whole life identity, and shaping your behavior and broad social impacts, like courtship and romance, and driving you to take on a certain career or hobby or creative pursuit because you're interested in impressing the people you're interested in sexually. So sexuality drives so much of human behavior that a lot of it's unconscious. And so we sort of don't think of things like pursuing a creative art as like an expression of like a sexuality, but almost, if you buy into, evolutionary theory, which I do, almost everything in our civilization has its roots in, sexuality, because, we're doing all these things and constructing this civilization and engaging in acts of creativity or whatever, due to these subconscious, drives for reproduction, essentially. And it sounds reductionistic, but, there's this long leash between the genetic imperatives which drive animal behavior and these sort of like cultural, construct that's layered on top of these fundamental biological drives. And so, similarly with autogynephilia, there's a sexual component at the foundation, but there's a lot of leeway in terms of how that gets expressed culturally. So just because the sexuality is at the core of this phenomenon, it doesn't mean that every time you're, expressing that sexuality, it doesn't mean that you're engaged in some, explicitly horny act of arousal or something like that. It becomes sort of like baked into your broader social self construct or self-concept or whatever. So that's kind of all I'll say there, is just that, and again, I'm talking about my own life here. I'm not talking about other people. So maybe for other people's stories, Serrano's model of the like subconscious sex coming first, which like, and then that comes first, and then due to social factors, you go through this cross-dressing phase as a non-classical trans woman, and then later on, you sort of normalize all that. That might be true for some people. For me personally, though, like the causal story in the autogynephilic model explains my life best in terms of the cross-dressing arousal stuff being the foundational core thing. So in the chicken and the egg model, for me, the cross-dressing was really the egg, and then the chicken was the full-blown like social gender dysphoria, like subconscious sex. Well, at that point, it my subconscious sex wasn't subconscious. Like I constructed it consciously, essentially, and then because I transitioned, like that consciously constructed sex concept, identity concept became normalized, and then it became subconscious. So it wasn't subconscious when I was like 2 years old. It was subconscious when I was like 30 years old, only after having gone through a conscious process of constructing this identity, which I did, very deliberately in order to pass, because I wanted a socially acceptable self concept to live my life as a trans feminine person, as a trans woman. So for me, there's very much an element of deliberate, narrative construction to build this identity in a way that's socially acceptable. But maybe that's not true for everyone, but that's what happened in my case. So yeah, hopefully this was helpful in sort of thinking about these different models and what's going on with these cross-gender fantasies, embodiment fantasies, and sort of like the causal origins of like what's happening with all this stuff. So this video has already gone on too long, so I'll stop it there. Thanks for watching.